Alright, we've created our database. Now let's do something with it. Let's create a new class and just name it SQL. Now we're going to include system.data.SQL server CE. Okay, now let's make a new static variable, public static SQL CE connection. This will be the connection to our database if you couldn't tell. And let's make a new constant string, public const string SQL query path equals SQL queries. This is where we will have our pre-written queries, so we don't have to actually hard code any query into our application. So if we want to go and change something, you can just go to the file, make some changes, and then go change the arguments around. So you don't have to go through every single file, find where it is, change this, blah blah blah. It'll just make life easier, and you'll understand in a bit. So now let's make a new method, public void open string path. That'll be the path to our database file, which we have right here. Now if connection not equal to null and connection.state equals connection state.open, then return. We don't actually need this. This is just a little safeguard, but you don't have to have this if you don't want to. Connection equals new SQL CE connection, and our data source will be the path, and connection dot open. Now let's make our close method and make this static. Almost forgot. Public static void close. If connection not equal to null and connection dot state not equal to state dot opened equals connection state dot closed, then return. Again, just a safeguard. You don't really need to have this if you don't want to. Connection dot close and connection equals null. Now the method we're about to code now is what will make our life easier in the long run if we have a bunch of different queries. Public static string get query, string name params object args, string query equals file dot read all text, path dot combine SQL query path and name. This just adds the the backslash between the two, so we don't have to actually do it manually. And add to name plus dot SQL. And now if args dot length greater than 0, query equals string dot format query and our arguments, and then return query. So what this does, and what you'll see in a little bit, is we will write our query files, and then we'll just have them on the disk instead of being hard-coded into the program. And then we will call get query to get our query from the disk, and then it'll read it, and then we'll have certain arguments such as string.format, and then if our argument length is greater than 0, we'll call string.format, which will replace our arguments in the SQL file, so the query's executor doesn't yell at us, and so nothing doesn't look weird, nothing becomes or goes weary and odd. And then it'll return our query with our newly replaced arguments. And you'll understand how this comes into play in a bit. Now let's make a couple of new folders. Just name this SQL. And queries. Now add a new item. Now we'll create our queries for inserting and checking our users in our database, etc., etc. Now a new code file, and name this user_register.sql. And this query will be quite simple. It'll just be insert into users, username and password. And if you remember from last tutorial, that is the name of our column. So with insert into, we insert into, it will be our database, and then we can choose the columns we want to insert into. In this case, it will be username and password. And the values that will be in those columns will be our arguments. So first argument will be our username, and the second argument will be our password. This is what we'll use string.format for. So we don't have to go in there, so we don't have to write it from scratch and hard-code it in the program, and so we don't have to go and replace this manually. String.format does all that stuff for us. So now that we have our register query, let's make a new one. Except name it user_check.sql. Now we will do select asterisk, which means select any column from users where username equals and our argument. So basically just what this does is it'll check the database where the username equals our argument. If the username is in the database, then it'll be returned, or any column that has that username will be returned. However, we'll only allow each user to have a unique username, so no one can have the same thing. This is what we'll check first before we execute our register query. Okay, before we move on, let's just add one more variable. Public static object lock equals new object. Like, we'll use this so we can only access the database one at a time, because when we do this, it's going to be multi-threaded, so we could have multiple things basically coming in at the same time. So this will be locked, so only one user can access the database at a time. Just another safeguard. Now let's add a new class. Now we're going to actually use our newly created queries. And name this user management. Now we will create a method to check and see if the username exists. Public static bool exists. String username. Bool res equals false. Lock sql.lock. sqlce command equals new sqlce command sql.getQuery user check and username sql.connection. Now, as you can see with our get query command, it'll read our query from the disk, it'll set